We're standing along the Orange Plank Road. If we were to continue off in that direction, it would take us to Orange Courthouse, the county seat of Orange County. If we were to go in that direction, it'll take us up into the wilderness. This is sort of kind of one of the edges of the wilderness. We're going to push off into that direction to get it out of the wilderness and into civilization. Mine Run itself is just a couple miles off to my right in that direction, but the opening engagements here take place to the east of Mine Run. We're at a location known as New Hope Church, one of several churches that was built by Melcy Chancellor. This one dates back to 1857, although the rebuilt church was put up in 1908, I believe it was, and then we've had lots of expansions and stuff. Just a really neat little bustling church out here in Mine Run, a little village called Golddale, if we're talking about the specifics of the settlement. And it's here where we're going to have some of the first actions on the southernmost part. We talked about the three prongs of approach that the Federals are taking. We've talked a little bit about Gouverneur K. Warren's 2nd Corps coming down the middle along the Orange Turnpike, which is off to my left just a couple miles, straight shot into Orange County. We also talked about French and Sedgwick, the 3rd and 6th Corps coming across Jacobs Ford and then getting themselves into trouble at Payne's Farm. And here along Orange Plank Road, we have got the 1st Corps following the 5th Corps. And to get those Federals onto the field, I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come and talk a little bit about the advance of Tardy George.
Thank you. The 1st and 5th Corps are going to cross the Rapidan at Culpeper Mine Ford and begin moving down into this area. Meade has ordered these 2 corps to come down and extend the Union left. They are going to be the Union left flank, the right flank then moving up toward the Orange Turnpike to connect with Gouverneur Warren at Robinson's Tavern. But as the Union infantry are making their way into this area, they're preceded by Union cavalry under David McMurtry Gregg, and then coming up along the Orange Plank Road from the direction of Orange is Jeb Stuart and the Confederate cavalry. Now Jeb Stuart is preceding Henry Heath's division from A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps. Lee is accompanying Hill, as Chris mentioned in an earlier video, along the Orange Plank Road. But again, out in front is Jeb Stuart and his cavalry. Now, Jeb Stuart is wearing 2 hats during the fall of 1863. He's not only commanding all of Lee's cavalry, but he's the de facto commander for Wade Hampton's division. Wade Hampton had been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863, and he's out of action. So Stuart is out here acting not only as the overall cavalry commander, but as a division commander. And it's with Hampton's division that he's going to begin engaging with David Gregg's Union cavalrymen. There's going to be a lot of skirmishing, moving back and forth throughout the area that we're standing in until the infantry is eventually going to get up and deploy onto the field of battle. But the cavalry fighting isn't over yet. Just a couple days later, Tom Roster's Virginia Brigade is actually going to swing into the Union rear, capturing a number of Union wagons and artillery pieces as the main infantry fighting is taking place to the north at Payne's Farm, and is again spreading through this area as Meade lays plans to get at Lee after the fighting at Payne's Farm. I'd like to bring Chris back on to talk a little bit more about what's going on in the Union headquarters after the fighting at Payne's Farm.
So the slow escalation here on this side of the battlefield really kind of then deprives Meade of having additional forces back at Robinson's Tavern at that concentration that he was hoping for. And so as a result, Meade's got to figure out what to do next. So on the morning of the 28th, he's going to cautiously advance across his whole line. He'll finally have the troops here. Newton's going to kind of swing in and extend Warren's line in this direction. Sykes will be able to connect. They're all going to push forward. French and Sedgwick are going to be able to push forward, and the Confederates seem to be gone. They're going to get all the way down to the banks of Mine Run and suddenly see on the far side this incredibly powerful set of works that seems to have been magically thrown up overnight, and realize that they were going to have to cross this stream, go across open fields of fire uphill against this new position. And no easy places to cross the stream. Confederates are going to dam it up in places. One soldier says it becomes a veritable Red Sea to us. It was dammed by the Confederates and it was dammed by us. And so Meade's going to try to figure out, gosh, are there any weak spots? His corps commanders can't find any. And again, this is all because things were slowed down on the crossing on the 26th. The inability for the army to concentrate on the 27th, he's lost his element of surprise, and now what? And as Sarah mentioned in our first video, Ulysses S. Grant had a victory out in Chattanooga. Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address has redefined what this war is all about. Incredible political pressure, and Meade finds himself stymied. So one of his corps commanders, Gouverneur K. Warren, the wonderkind of this army, is going to come to him with an idea. Rather than try to push across the stream, why not do a flank march through this area where we're standing along an unfinished railroad that is off to my right, kind of behind Sarah. It's extending all the way back to Orange. This is the same unfinished railroad that will play a key role in the Battle of the Wilderness. It goes all the way to Fredericksburg. It played a battle in the role in Fredericksburg. And what Warren wants to do is move his guys down there and get on Lee's right flank and attack. And so Meade gives him permission to do that. It's going to take all day on the 29th for Warren to swing his men. He's going to have about 28,000 men to make this movement with. And I always think, 28,000 men moving through the wilderness to get on someone's flank. This is sounding familiar to me if anybody's flashing back to Chancellorsville. And Warren is going to get over into position. I'm going to ask Dan to come back on here in a second because, Dan, it seems like the stakes are high for Warren making this movement. And he gets where he needs to be, but...
I couldn't agree more. In fact, Meade bases his entire plan off of Warren's movement. Whatever Warren finds, however his fighting on his front develops, is going to dictate what Meade does later on through the course of the fighting. Meade eventually is going to plan to have Warren swing around Lee's right flank. He's going to use the remaining troops to probe Lee's center and then order John Sedgwick way back up on the right near Payne's Farm to make an attack against Lee's far left flank, which is stretching toward the Rapidan. But all of this hinges on Gouverneur Warren. The attack is set to go off roughly about 8 o'clock in the morning of November the 30th, the last day of November, and it's going to begin at around 8 a.m. with a pre-planned Union artillery barrage emanating from the Union center. Meade is preparing for this attack. He's preparing to send his men forward on both of the flanks. The artillery opens on time as planned, but as Meade is sitting back up near the Orange Turnpike, he can't see down to this area, but he can definitely hear down to this area. And he hears nothing but silence. And 8:15 comes along, silence. 8:30, it's about 8:50, about an hour behind schedule. A rider's going to come up to Meade, a dispatch from Warren, telling him that Warren has decided to postpone the attack. He has found that the Confederate defenses are too strong, and indeed they are, because Jeb Stuart is eyes of Lee's army. He's been out here watching Warren's movement. He's reporting back through the course of the previous day to Lee, and Lee orders Hill to extend his line, extend his right flank down into this area, and to continue to build those fortifications. And Meade is going to receive word that the Confederate defenses are too strong. Warren has decided not to launch the attack. And again, the entire operation is based off of what Warren is planning to do. So Meade himself, he's going to ride down here and confer with Warren, and it's going to be a very volatile exchange, to say the least, between the two officers.
Part of the problem is that Warren took all day to get here on the 29th, and so he loses that element of surprise. He's going to camp overnight. And one of the myths of Mine Run is that he lights a bunch of campfires to show his mighty host, an effort to scare Lee out of his position. But Lee is just going to extend that line, bring in all of his reserves. Dan talked about Jeb Stuart kind of serving as a division commander. They will get with Hampton's men into Warren's rear and kind of get a good sense of what the picture looks like. And that's what allows Lee to have the confidence to extend that line. So when Warren wakes up and he sees these works, and remember, he's a trained engineer, and he's looking at these works that appeared overnight, and he's like, can't do it. When he sends word back to Meade, Meade's head explodes. He's like, the man has half of my army. He has ruined me. Again, think about the stakes for Meade at this point. And so he thunders down here, as Dan said, have this heated exchange. And Warren said, by the full light of day, I realized the assault could not be made. And under my own power, I called it off. And he shows Meade, who's also a trained engineer, what's going on. And Meade comes to the same conclusion. And I really like this decision. Despite all of the pressure on Meade to do something, he recognizes that his men were going to be open, exposed position for 8 minutes to cross the terrain to assault that position in cold weather that will freeze wounded men to death out on the field. He doesn't want to throw the lives of his men away against a position he knows he can't take. So he's going to spend the rest of the day like, oh, what do I do? What do I do? Looking for some other option, and he can't find one. So that next night, his men will light campfires, so bitterly cold that soldiers freeze to death on the picket line. And Meade will take the opportunity to finally escape. Lee, very happy to be behind his works, will let that happen. Not realizing it's going on, Lee will finally decide to launch an attack, but by that point, Meade has slipped away. But Dan, I know that you've studied Meade's reaction. Once they finally get back to their camps in Culpeper, he writes a very telling letter to his wife that sort of captures his own frustrations here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Meade's options are very few when he finds that he cannot launch the big assault on November the 30th. He can continue forward with the attack, which, as Chris mentioned, would probably be suicidal, not only for the Army, but for his own career. He can pull off to Fredericksburg, but that would leave the road open to Washington and expose Washington. And also, because of the defeat the previous December, the Union Army is not going to be operating around Fredericksburg. So Meade decides to disengage, withdraw back over the Rapidan. He himself is going to set up his headquarters near St. James's Church on the old Brandy Station battlefield, and there he will spend the winter of 1863 and 1864. But as Chris mentioned, Meade is going to write a very telling letter back home. And I think this letter is interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, if you read through the letter, Meade does not name any of his subordinate commanders. He is that angry with, I think, what happened here, or what did not happen here, I should say. But he's also going to write, through this roughly 2-page letter, a very telling sentence. And it reflects his mindset here on November the 30th of 1864. And he writes that I would rather be ignominiously dismissed and suffer anything than knowingly and willingly have thousands of brave men slaughtered for nothing. Meade shows great moral fortitude here at Mine Run by not going forward and launching that grand attack, despite the fact that he knows that he is going to come under immense criticism from the Lincoln administration. And I mentioned that Meade spends the winter in Culpeper County. Well, he's going to be in Culpeper County near Brandy Station for the winter of 1863-64, but he's also going to be spending time between Culpeper and Washington, D.C., testifying before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War regarding his actions not only here at Mine Run, but also during the Gettysburg campaign as well. Chris?
And he writes that letter to his wife, and the opening sentence is amazing. I mean, he says, "You will be gratified to know that your fondest wish will finally come true, and I'm apt to be relieved." He expects to get fired as a result of this. And there are days of tension as Meade's waiting for the axe to fall, but it doesn't fall. In part because he does have a lot of subordinates who go to Washington and lobby on his behalf. The Army itself is a little frustrated by what happened here because we did all this moving. They start this on Thanksgiving Day. They don't even get a Thanksgiving meal of hardtack as a result. And so there's a lot of frustration, but then they realize, wait, he decided to not throw us into battle. He valued our lives over his own career. And this is where really Meade makes this army his. They love him after this. Up to this point, they respect him. He's their commander. They love him after this because they realize he's not going to needlessly sacrifice their lives. And Meade even says in that letter to his wife, "There'll be some critics who think that I should have tried and failed and let my failure serve as testament to my good judgment." But he doesn't want to let these guys go through that needless slaughter. So it's a great moment of moral courage. The aftermath of battle is also, there are going to be a few thousand casualties on both sides here, but one of the reasons we've stopped here at New Hope Church, and I'm going to bring Sarah on here to talk a little bit about this, is because in the aftermath of battle, we still do have casualties. We still do have men who have to put their shattered lives back together as a result. And we have some poignant testimonies as a result of that kind of speak to the fact that even though there was no great battle, to some of these men, it was still a devastating experience in their lives. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about, in the wake of the fighting here, you've got some accounts that really speak to the experience of these men.
I do, and thank you, Chris. One of the things that I like to do, particularly when we're at a big anniversary of a battle or a campaign, is take some time and find individual stories of soldiers who were present there. And one of the ways that I do this is on the Library of Congress's website, where they have fantastic photographs that have been digitized, and we can see them right there. I'm sure you're familiar with Gary Edelman's study of the landscape and battle photographs of the battlefields. I kind of gravitate toward the portrait photographs a little more. So I found a few soldiers who were here in the Mine Run campaign, and had to search for it in a few different ways, because it's Mine Run, it's Paynes Farm, and New Hope Church. And through all of those, we were able to find some really interesting stories. So the first one that I want to show you, this is James P. Mills. He is in the 53rd North Carolina Infantry. And he is actually listed in his service record as being a musician, and he seems to have been a musician through the duration of the war. So he's actually born in Virginia, but then his family moves to North Carolina, which is where he enlists from. He's noted as being a farmer prior to his enlistment on March 27th, 1862, when he signs up for 3 years of service. We know that he was in a hospital during the summer of 1863, possibly sick, maybe even wounded after Gettysburg, but by the fall he's returned to his regiment. He is definitely on the muster and the pay sheets for his regiment in the period of the Mine Run campaign. The 53rd North Carolina Infantry is in Daniel's brigade of Rhodes's division in the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. And General Daniels writes in his report at the very end, complimenting the men in his command, "I feel it my duty to state that in consequence of the extremely inclement weather, the constant labor, marching, and loss of sleep, my officers and men were greatly fatigued. Notwithstanding, they were very vigilant and evinced great cheerfulness and good conduct in the discharge of their duties." And as Chris and Dan have talked about, the weather is very cold. Men are freezing to death in this campaign. So there's high praise there, and that would fall for James P. Mills of the 53rd North Carolina Infantry. He's probably a fifer, perhaps a drummer, maybe a bugler, but he's listed as musician, so a very young man in the regiment. Now, doing a little further research, I found some images that seem to be Mills later in life. So here he is with his family, and this comes from a local historical society in North Carolina. And then this other one was on Library of Congress, in this house that is presumably his, and listed as being shown with his wife and daughter there on the front porch as well. So here we have a soldier who survives the war, survives this campaign, and actually all the soldiers I'm featuring or talking about in this video, they all survive, so spoiler alert there. The next soldier's image that I came across is Henry D. Scott. And at the time of the Mine Run campaign, he's in the 5th Massachusetts Light Artillery Battery. He'll actually change artillery units, and we'll find him in a different Massachusetts battery when we get to the Overland Campaign in 1864. But he's actually out here in the fighting that's happening around the vicinity of New Hope Church, which we were talking about a bit earlier in this video. And he writes about the Mine Run campaign and his experience in the battle. So I'll share a little bit of that. So this is post-war writing. It actually appears in the 5th Massachusetts Battery Regimental History, or I guess it would be Battery History. The 5th Army Corps found the enemy strongly entrenched beyond Mine Run, a treacherous stream. The 5th Corps occupied the left of the line of battle, the right reaching all the way to Robertson's Tavern. He means Robinson's Tavern. As Chris mentioned earlier, they'll sometimes mix the names there. The whole country was almost a wilderness. All the army was up at this point. On November 27, 1863, the 5th Massachusetts Battery stood in line of battle on a rise of ground, in a lane, scrub and brushwood on either side, and a dense forest of pines, but a short distance across an open swale. Nothing was to be seen in front. Sounds like a little bit of an odd place to place an artillery battery. He goes on our right, we could see a battery engaged and shells were exploding all about us. A lead horse of the battery was struck by a piece of shell and dropped to its knees, but was not killed. An officer rode up to Captain Phillips and asked why he was not engaged. Phillips replied he had no orders, nor could he see anything to fire at. They've got all this woods in front of them. The officer said, "Use your judgment as an officer. Fire over the woods to your front." So the battery filed into the brush on the left of the lane and opened fire through the woods. No enemy was to be seen, and our troops on the left, as far as could be seen, were lying on the ground face down, knapsacks on their backs. A lull came in the firing, and the men of the battery set to work cutting down the trees and brush to enable the cannoneers to get the limber about in case we had to move out. While we were about this duty, a sharp fragment of a shell struck the forefinger of my left hand, and I rode to a hospital in the rear to have it dressed. Returning to the battery, I found it had been decided that the left was unassailable. So that's the Warren's decision, which Meade backs up. The artillery was ordered to Robertson's Tavern, but remained in position during the night. So Lieutenant Scott, he has a very minor injury, an inconvenience, if you will. He goes back to a hospital, has this wound on his left hand bandaged, and then he actually comes back to the battery, because in later notes in the battery's history, we find that he actually goes back to a hospital, meaning he had returned to the regiment at some point. But he'll survive the injury and, as I mentioned earlier, change batteries in the spring of 1864. So one other photo that I found that I wanted to share with you, this is Henry P. Bowditch, and he is an officer in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. So if you are a fan of maritime history or like navigation and mathematics, this is one of the grandsons of American mathematician Nathaniel Bowditch, who wrote I believe it's Aids to Navigation. We can check that and I'll be corrected in a text, I'm sure. But this Bowditch, Henry Bowditch, graduates from Harvard in 1861. He will survive the war. He'll actually go back to Harvard, graduate from their medical school in 1868, and then eventually, much later in his illustrious career, become dean of that medical school. But in 1861, he enlists. He's a 2nd lieutenant in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. He's 21 years old. He's risen to the rank of captain by autumn of 1863. And in the cavalry fighting, which Dan has briefly mentioned, here around New Hope Church, he is wounded in the right arm. And his wounding is noted by other soldiers. He's actually going to come in contact with probably one of the most famous wounded soldiers at the New Hope location, and that is Charlie Longfellow. So Bowditch and Longfellow will actually both end up getting evacuated in a same ambulance after having their wounds initially bandaged. Both will survive their injuries. Now, who is Charlie Longfellow? He is the eldest son of the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who wrote Paul Revere's Ride and many other famous poems that have come into American memory of history and all of that. So the news of Charlie Longfellow's injury is going to be sent to Massachusetts, and the Longfellow family has already been through a lot in recent years. Henry Longfellow had lost his wife in a tragic accident. He's raising their young children on his own. His son Charlie runs off against his father's wishes and ends up in the military, connected to the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry, and Charlie's badly wounded here in the fighting around New Hope Church. And it's in the midst of the tension and the uncertainty of getting the news that his son has been injured, possibly dying, that Longfellow writes what becomes a famous Christmas song. It's called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And if you go and look at all the verses, it talks about the cannon's mouth and these questions of how can there be peace on earth. And it's really questions that Longfellow was struggling with, and that in many ways people were struggling with in homes all across America, in North and South. And so this poetry is written, becomes a song. Without the historical context of it, it can seem like a very dark, a very sad Christmas song, but the ending is a hopeful part. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor does he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, and peace on earth, goodwill to men, is kind of Longfellow's conclusion there. So it takes a end of year campaign, and from that comes a Christmas song that many of us are probably still familiar with. Chris, do you have other things to add?
And most modern renditions of the carol leave out the booming cannons and the
they
cannons
do.
mouth and all that stuff too. So we have this warm.
But you kind of have to, at least in the church hymnals, you kind of have to do all 5 verses that they do print, or else it kind of doesn't make sense. It's a very narrative poetry, so at least it's there, but they do leave the canon part out.
Right.
Not quite great for Christmas Eve services.
But kind of a neat connection that we have here to this campaign that most people sort of forget about. I'm going to ask Dan Davis to come back here in just a second, because we also have another legacy here, and that, of course, is battlefield preservation. And the American Battlefield Trust has done some great work here on this front of the battlefield. The Paynes Farm preservation dates back to the early 2000s. This is brand spanking new. Tell us about it, Dan.
It is. It's new as of May of this year, and here we are in November on the precipice, or really commemorating the 160th anniversary of the Mine Run campaign. And it's very appropriate that just several months ago, again back in May, back in the spring, working with interested landowners, we were able to put under easement over 700 acres, a very large chunk. Think about that. 700 acres. We typically don't get the opportunity to preserve such large tracts all at once, but we have here at Mine Run. Mine Run's somewhat unique. We have the 680 acres at Paynes Farm, and now over 700 acres here under easement. And we could not have done this without your support. And so I would like for all of you who are watching, especially members of the American Battlefield Trust, if you're not a member, head over to battlefields.org, get some more information, but especially to our members, thank you so much for supporting battlefield preservation and education. We could not do and accomplish all that we have without your generous support. So on behalf of all of us, I say thank you. And with that, I'm going to bring Chris back on.
So we've given you lots to think about here at Mine Run, and as we wrap up, we tend to jump from Gettysburg to the wilderness, and we forget about that fall. So much happens. The stakes are incredibly high. The politics are incredibly high. The commanders on both sides are facing really keen decisions and putting themselves personally and their careers personally in harm's way here at Mine Run. And so what happens as a result of this, we're going to see Ulysses S. Grant, who won at Chattanooga. He's going to get the call to come to the east. Lincoln can't do anything about Meade. He can't fire him because Meade hasn't really done anything wrong. He just hasn't done that next big right thing. So Lincoln solves that problem by promoting Grant over Meade and then leaving Meade in position. He's the victor of the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. The elections are coming up, and Lincoln needs Pennsylvania, so he can't poke that beehive and to do anything to the state's favored son. So he brings Grant to the east, and we're going to see a whole new change of warfare. Many aspects of this campaign are going to then expand and play out during the 1864 Overland Campaign. And we're going to see what happens to the Wonder Kid, Gouverneur K. Warren. We're going to see how Meade reacts to that new change in leadership. We're going to see fortifications spring up overnight. A lot of things that we're going to associate with that Overland Campaign we see first here as a preview. So thanks for spending some time previewing that with us. Check out all our videos on the American Battlefield Trust YouTube page. Lots of resources for you to explore. Go on over to battlefields.org and check out our website for the additional resources we have available there as well. I want to thank Sarah K. Bierle behind the camera for the great work that she's done. Dan Davis, great friend of mine over here, doing fantastic work for us as well. And I want to thank you for everything you do for us. I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you for all you do to support battlefield education and preservation.